A small boy, around 9 years old, sits cross-legged on the carpeted floor outside a bathroom door at Kensington Palace. The door is locked. On the other side, his mother is crying. He does not knock. He does not call out. He folds a tissue, presses it flat, and slides it through the narrow gap between the door and the floor. A moment later, he folds another. He will sit there as long as it takes. The boy is Prince William of Wales, second in line to the British throne. The woman behind the door is Diana, Princess of Wales. The detail comes from Diana herself, given in the early 1990s to the journalist Andrew Morton through a chain of intermediaries, and it has the quality of a parable, because in a sense it is one. It contains, in a single gesture, the central fact of William's childhood. He was not, in the ordinary meaning of the word, a child being raised. He was a child raising, in small, careful increments, the adults around him. The public in those years saw something else entirely. They saw a flaxen-haired boy in smocked shorts and knee socks, posed on a Highgrove lawn between two doting parents. They saw the wave from the balcony, the first day of school photograph, the obligatory grin beside a polo pony. They saw the future of the monarchy packaged for magazine covers and biscuit tins. What they did not see, because it could not be photographed, was the weight he was already carrying. A collapsing marriage, a mother in acute emotional distress, a father preoccupied and largely absent, and, threading through all of it, the quiet, unspoken understanding that one day, whether he wanted it or not, the crown would settle on his head. This is the story of how that gap between the boy on the biscuit tin and the boy on the bathroom floor formed the man who will one day be king. He was born on the 21st of June, 1982, at 9:03 in the evening at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. The choice of location was, in royal terms, a small revolution. Every previous heir to the British throne in living memory had been born at home, in a palace, attended by household physicians. Diana, only 20 years old and barely 11 months married, had insisted on a hospital. She had got her way. From the moment of his birth, then, William's life was being shaped by his mother's quiet, persistent rebellions against the protocols of the institution he was destined to lead. Charles, Prince of Wales, stood beside the bed. He was 33 and visibly relieved. Outside St Mary's, a crowd had gathered behind crash barriers in the warm summer evening. Champagne corks popped on the pavement. The bells of St Paul's were rung. The town crier of the City of London announced the birth in full ceremonial dress. A 41-gun salute was fired in Hyde Park. The Prince and Princess of Wales had produced, with efficient haste, a male heir. The line of succession was secured for another generation. The country, or at least the part of it that paid attention to such things, exhaled. The marriage into which William had been born was, by then, already in trouble. Charles and Diana had wed on the 29th of July, 1981, at St Paul's Cathedral, before a global television audience estimated at 750 million. It had been sold to the public, and to the bride, as a fairy tale. The reality, even before the honeymoon, was something else. Camilla Parker Bowles, the woman Charles had loved before his marriage and would continue to love after it, remained a constant, ghostly presence in the household, in the correspondence, in the telephone calls. Diana, very young, very isolated, and increasingly unwell, had begun to suffer from bulimia. By the time William was placed in her arms at St Mary's, she was battling severe postnatal depression, on top of an eating disorder she could not name in public, and a husband she could not reach in private. Into this household, in the late summer of 1982, came Barbara Barnes. She was 42, the daughter of a Norfolk forestry worker, and had spent more than a decade as nanny to the children of Colin and Anne Tennant. She arrived at Kensington Palace with a quietly radical credo. "I am here to help Princess Diana, not to take over," she told reporters, and, more pointedly, there is no need for nannies to be in uniform. She wore ordinary clothes. She called the boy William. She treated him, by every account that survives, as a small person first and a prince second. Beside her worked the deputy nanny, Olga Powell, a steadier, more conventional figure who would remain in the household far longer, and who many later accounts credit with providing William with one of the most consistent and undemanding adult presences of his entire childhood. Diana, meanwhile, was determined to be a mother in a way that no Princess of Wales had attempted in living memory. She did the school run herself when she could. She took William to McDonald's, queuing at the counter like any other customer, and watched him eat chicken nuggets in a plastic booth. She took him to water parks, to the cinema, to amusement arcades. She insisted, against considerable household resistance, that he be allowed friendships with children who were not vetted for pedigree. The photographs of these outings, when they leaked, were treated by the press as charming eccentricities. Inside the palace, they were treated as something closer to insurrection. And then there were the other outings, the ones that scandalized the courtiers most of all. From the time he was about 4 years old, Diana began taking William, quietly and without fanfare, to places that no heir to the throne had ever been taken as a child. Homeless shelters, hostels, hospices for patients dying of AIDS, at a time when the disease was still surrounded by terror and stigma. She would hold the hand of a dying man, and her small son would stand beside her, watching. AIDS protested. The boy was too young. The images were inappropriate. Diana was unmoved. "I want him to have an understanding of people's emotions," she said, in a line that has since been quoted many times. "Their insecurities, people's distress, and their hopes and dreams." She was, in effect, conducting an education in human suffering, and she was conducting it on a child who had not yet learned to ride a bicycle without stabilizers. Whether one regards this as wisdom or as a burden depends, perhaps, on whether one believes a 4-year-old can metabolize the sight of a man dying alone. What is not in dispute is that William, very early, began to display an emotional vocabulary that startled the adults around him. Teachers at his first school, Wetherby in Notting Hill, where he started in January 1987 at the age of 4.5, noted it almost immediately. He was watchful. He was polite to a degree that seemed almost performed. He was acutely aware that he was different, and acutely careful not to make others feel it. Classmates had been instructed to call him William, without title or honorific, and the staff did their best to maintain the fiction of ordinariness. But the fiction had limits. There was the protection officer at the gate every morning. There were the photographers who, despite agreements, sometimes appeared at the school perimeter. There was the unmistakable fact of the chauffeured car. A teacher from that period later recalled the boy asking her, when he was perhaps 6 years old, why the photographers always shouted at his mother. The teacher did not know how to answer. The boy, she said, did not ask again. Inside the household, meanwhile, something was shifting. By 1987, Barbara Barnes was gone. The official version was that she had decided to leave to pursue other opportunities. The version that circulated among staff, and was later corroborated by several sources close to the family, was less tidy. Diana, it was said, had come to feel that the nanny had grown too close to William, that the bond between them threatened her own. The household was becoming, in small and largely invisible ways, a battlefield of competing affections, and a 5-year-old boy was learning, without anyone teaching him, that loving the wrong adult too visibly could have consequences. By September 1990, he was 8 years old, and his parents had decided he was ready for boarding school. The choice was Ludgrove in Berkshire, a deliberately remote and old-fashioned prep school, chosen in part for its distance from London and its cooperative attitude toward the press. On the morning he left, the car was loaded at Kensington Palace. Diana sat beside him in the back. By every account that has survived from that day, including her own to friends, she wept for most of the journey. The boy did not. He held her hand. He looked out of the window. He had, already, the public face ready. He had been practicing it, in one form or another, for most of his short life. The car pulled out of Kensington Palace on a grey September morning in 1990, and the boy in the back seat was, by every account of those who saw him, the calmer of the two passengers. Diana was crying. William, 8 years old, sat very still, looking out of the window. He had already learned that one of them had to hold the line, and that on this particular morning it would be him. Ludgrove School in Berkshire was waiting at the end of the drive, and with it the next chapter of a childhood being conducted, in part, for an audience. Ludgrove had been chosen with care. It sat behind long gravel drives and high hedges, in countryside that discouraged casual visitors. The headmasters, Gerald and Janet Barber, ran an unfussy establishment that took the protection of their pupils seriously. Newspapers were kept out of the common rooms. Staff were briefed to treat William as a boy among boys. For a few hours a day, in the classrooms and on the playing fields, the arrangement very nearly worked. He played football. He was, by the accounts of contemporaries, competitive and physically fearless, with a temper he was learning to manage. He was popular without effort, which is the only kind of popularity that lasts at that age. But the protective bubble had cracks, and through them the rest of his life began to seep. By the autumn of 1992, the marriage of his parents had moved from private misery to public theatre. Andrew Morton's biography of Diana, published that June with her covert cooperation, had detonated in the press. Charles, in his own circle, was preparing his own counter-narrative. The newspapers were full of it. Boys at boarding school are not gentle with material like that, and the staff at Ludgrove could only confiscate so many tabloids. On a December afternoon in 1992, Diana drove herself to Ludgrove to see her elder son. The visit was unscheduled in any formal sense and brief. She wanted to tell William, before the rest of the country learned it, that she and his father would be separating. John Major would make the announcement in the House of Commons on the 9th of December. Diana wanted her son to hear it from her first. The conversation took place in the headmaster's private quarters. According to her own later account, given to friends and recorded in subsequent biographies, William listened in silence and then said, quietly, that he hoped they would both be happier now. He was 10 years old. The line has the cadence of something an adult might say to spare another adult's feelings. It was offered by a child. What followed, through 1993 and into 1994, has come to be called the War of the Waleses, and it was fought largely in print and on the airwaves. The Squidgygate tapes, the Camillagate tapes, the rival biographies, the strategically placed photographs. Each side had its champions in Fleet Street. Each side leaked, denied, briefed against the other. William, at Ludgrove, was not insulated from any of it. The headmasters did their best, but a boy of 11 who walks into a dormitory after lights out hears what the other boys have been reading. He learns to keep his face still. He learns which questions to ignore. In June 1994, his father sat down with the broadcaster Jonathan Dimbleby for a televised interview watched by some 14 million people in the United Kingdom alone. Pressed on the question of his marriage, Prince Charles admitted that he had been unfaithful, after the marriage had irretrievably broken down. The admission was carefully worded. The headlines that followed were not. William was 11. Royal staff who saw him in the days after have described a boy who became very quiet, who retreated into himself, who did not want to talk about what he had seen on television or read about in the corridors. Ken Wharf, Diana's protection officer in those years, would later write that William's way of coping was already by then to absorb rather than to express. He turned things inward. He did not slam doors. He had, by this age, become something more troubling than a witness to his parents' marriage. He had become a confidant. Diana, isolated and frightened and unmoored, had begun to speak to her elder son about matters that no mother ought to discuss with a child. Paul Burrell, her butler, and Patrick Jeffson, her private secretary, would each, in their later writings, describe the same pattern. She told William about her loneliness. She told him about the men in her life. She told him, in flashes, about her fears for her own safety. She called him her wise old man, and the nickname, affectionate as it was, contained an admission. She was leaning on him. Jeffson's phrase in his memoir was that William had been loaded with a burden he was too young to carry. The phrase is restrained. The reality, as those around the household described it, was that a boy of 12 was being asked to hold an adult woman together, in the gaps between school terms, in the rooms of Kensington Palace where the staff had learned to make themselves invisible. He was not, in any conventional sense, neglected. He was, in some respects, the most attended-to child in Britain. But the attention flowed in the wrong direction. He was the one being asked to listen. He was the one being asked to understand. And in November 1995, when his mother made the decision that would define the final chapter of her life, she did not warn him. On the 20th of November 1995, roughly 23 million people in the United Kingdom watched Diana, Princess of Wales, sit across from Martin Bashir in a Kensington Palace drawing room and speak with quiet devastation about the marriage that had collapsed around her. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she said, "so it was a bit crowded." She spoke about her bulimia, about her self-harm, about her doubts that her husband would ever be king. The interview ran for nearly an hour. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential pieces of television in the history of the British monarchy. William watched it at Eton, where he had begun his first term in September. He sat in the private quarters of his housemaster, Andrew Gailey, a scholarly Northern Irishman in his early 40s, who had quickly become one of the few adults in William's life asking nothing of him. Friends from Eton, speaking later and largely anonymously, described William's reaction in consistent terms. He was not, primarily, angry about what his mother had said. He was angry that she had not told him she was going to say it. He had learned about the interview the way the rest of the country had, in advance trails and newspaper speculation. He felt, by the accounts of those near him, ambushed. He reportedly did not speak to her for several days afterwards. When they next met, the conversation was difficult. Diana, who had braced for the public reaction, had not braced for her sons. She understood in the months that followed the weight she had placed on him. She tried, in her way, to make amends through ordinary pleasures. Go-karting at weekends, trips to the cinema with security at a discreet distance. The famous afternoon at Thorpe Park with William and Harry, the three of them on water rides, Diana in a baseball cap pulled low. There are photographs of those days, because there were always photographs. The very effort to give her sons an ordinary outing produced by the next morning front pages confirming that no outing of theirs could ever be ordinary. The compensation could not quite reach the wound it was meant to dress. Eton itself, beginning in September 1995, had been intended as the next sanctuary. The choice of school was, in its way, a small revolution. No heir to the throne had been to Eton in living memory. Charles had been sent to Gordonston in Scotland, an experience he later described in terms close to misery. Diana had pushed hard for Eton, partly because her own brothers had gone there, partly because it sat close enough to Windsor for the Queen to be a near presence, partly because she believed William needed the company of boys from a wider world than the one his father had known. A press agreement, brokered by the palace and accepted with various degrees of grace by the newspaper editors, kept photographers off the school grounds in exchange for occasional posed access at agreed moments. The arrangement held, mostly. There were breaches, and the palace was quick to complain about them, but William was permitted, within the walls of his house at Eton, something close to a normal adolescence. Andrew Gailey, his housemaster, has spoken sparingly about William in the decades since, and the discretion is itself revealing. He understood, those around him have said, that what the boy needed was an adult who did not require anything of him in return. Not affection, not confidence, not performance. Gailey provided structure. He provided privacy. He provided, in the small evening rituals of a boarding house, the closest thing to ordinary domestic life that William had known in years. The relationship would endure. When William later chose godparents and trusted advisers, Gailey's name recurred. The divorce of Charles and Diana was finalized on the 28th of August, 1996. William was 14. The settlement, hard-fought and bitter in places, included the stripping of Diana's style of Her Royal Highness. She was distressed by it. According to several sources close to her in those weeks, including Tiggy Legg Burke, the warm and informal nanny who had joined the household in 1993 and become a steady presence in the boys' lives, and Paul Burrell, William sought to console his mother with a promise. He told her, in words that have been reported in various forms but consistently in substance, not to worry. He would give the title back to her one day when he was king. Whether the exact phrasing was his or has been smoothed in the retelling is impossible now to know. What is clear is that a boy of 14 was, once again, the one offering reassurance. The current ran the wrong way, as it had since he was old enough to register the temperature of the rooms he walked into. By the early summer of 1997, the rhythm of his divided life had become, if not comfortable, at least familiar. Term time at Eton, with its rituals and its small, protected ordinariness. Weekends and holidays split between his mother in London and his father at Highgrove, with the long northern interlude at Balmoral each August. He was 15, tall now, taller than his mother, with the beginnings of the public manner that would later be described, by interviewers and dignitaries, as unusually composed for his age. Composed, again, is the word that recurs in every contemporary description. Composed by 12, composed by 14, composed at 15. The adults around him meant it as praise. In late July of 1997, William and Harry said goodbye to their mother at Kensington Palace and travelled north with their father to Balmoral. Diana was to spend part of August in the Mediterranean as the guest of Mohammed Al-Fayed. William knew, in the loose way that adolescents know such things, that there was a new man in her life. He had not yet met Dodi Fayed, and would not. The parting at Kensington Palace was, by all accounts, unremarkable, of the kind that happens 100 times in any divided family in any given summer. A hug, a wave, a car door closing. The Scottish hills were waiting. The grouse season was about to begin. He would see her, he assumed, in a few weeks. The summer of 1997 at Balmoral had the quality of a held breath. William, 15, and Harry, 12, were in the long Highland routine their grandmother preferred. Walks on the moors, picnics in the heather, the slow drag of dinners that never quite ended. Diana had spent the final weeks of July with them, before flying to the south of France, then on to Sardinia, then to Paris with Dodi Fayed. The last conversation William had with his mother was a telephone call from the yacht. According to accounts he gave years later, it was brief, rushed, and unsatisfying. He was distracted. She was distracted. He hung up, wishing he had said more, and then thought no more of it, because there would, of course, be another call. There was not. In the early hours of 31st of August, a Mercedes carrying Diana, Dodi Fayed, and the driver Henri Paul entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris at high speed, pursued by photographers on motorbikes. The car struck a pillar. Henri Paul and Dodi Fayed were killed at the scene. Diana, Princess of Wales, died in hospital in the early hours of the morning. She was 36. At Balmoral, the household was woken in stages. Prince Charles took the telephone calls through the night. He chose to let his sons sleep and to tell them himself in person when morning came. He went to William's room at around 7 o'clock. William, by his own later account, had slept poorly. He said afterwards that he had felt, without being able to explain it, that something was wrong before his father spoke. Whether that was true memory or the mind's later attempt to give shape to a moment without shape, it is the kind of detail he has chosen, repeatedly, to share. He wanted, even decades on, to mark the fact that the news did not arrive cleanly. Some part of him had already begun to know. What followed at Balmoral has been picked over for a quarter of a century. The decision by Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip to keep the boys in Scotland, away from television sets and newspapers, has been variously read as cold detachment or as old-fashioned protective instinct. The household removed the papers. The radios were turned off. The boys were taken to church on the morning of their mother's death. To outsiders, and especially to a press corps massing outside Buckingham Palace, the silence from Balmoral looked like indifference. Inside, it was something closer to triage. The grandparents' calculation was that routine, fresh air, and the company of dogs were better for 2 grieving children than rolling news. For William, the days at Balmoral were a strange, suspended interval. He walked, he fished, he kept Harry close. He did not, by every account, weep in front of the adults. The composure that had impressed his mother's friends when he was 9 had become, at 15, something like armour. The journalist Andrew Marr would later describe the William of that week as a boy who had been preparing, without knowing it, for exactly this for most of his life. The pressure from London, meanwhile, was extraordinary. The flowers outside Kensington Palace had risen into a tide. The newspapers, which had spent years pursuing Diana, now demanded that the Queen come south and grieve in public. By the middle of the week, the family had agreed. They returned to London. The flag at Buckingham Palace, breaking centuries of protocol, was lowered to half-mast. The Queen made a live broadcast, and the question of the funeral and of whether two boys should walk behind their mother's coffin in front of the world was being decided in rooms they were not entirely in. The walk took place on the 6th of September, 1997. The procession moved from St James's Palace, along the Mall, through the streets of central London to Westminster Abbey. William, 15, walked alongside his father, his grandfather Prince Philip, his uncle Earl Spencer, and his brother Harry, 12. Head bowed, hands clasped. The coffin draped in the royal standard, topped with white lilies and a small envelope marked, in Harry's hand, Mummy. 1 million people lined the route. The estimated global television audience was 2.5 billion. The only sound for long stretches was the hooves of the horses, and periodically the sound of mourners crying out. William said later that what got him through was the noise of his own footsteps and the discipline of putting one foot in front of the other. He has called it the longest and most traumatic day of his life. He has also said, in a rare reflective moment, that he is glad he did it and would have regretted not doing it, and that both of those things can be true at once. The detail that has become emblematic and is supported by multiple accounts from inside the royal household concerns Prince Philip. There had been resistance to the boys walking. Charles was uncertain. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, argued against it. It was Philip, the grandfather, who reportedly settled the matter by telling William, in private, that if William walked, he would walk with him. He would not let the boy do it alone. Whatever else one thinks of Prince Philip, that sentence is one of the kindest in the recorded history of the House of Windsor. The walk is the visual centre of the entire story this film is trying to tell. A boy of 15 performing duty at the moment of greatest private agony, in front of more witnesses than any child in history has ever had. Whatever childhood remained to William ended somewhere along the Mall. There is no version of him after that procession who is not, in some essential way, already an adult. Within weeks, he was back at Eton. The school, on the instruction of his housemaster Andrew Gailey and with the agreement of the family, did not treat him as a special case. He attended lessons, he played sport, he sat his exams. The Northern Irish housemaster, scholarly and quiet, became one of the most important adults in his life precisely because he asked nothing of William that William did not volunteer. Tiggy Legg Burke, the family's nanny since 1993, provided a different kind of warmth, the kind that involved Land Rovers and dogs, and not having to talk about anything in particular. Between them, they held a frame around him, while he did not, by any account, talk about his mother for a very long time. He developed in those years a wariness toward photographers that bordered on hatred. The men on motorbikes who had pursued his mother through Paris were, to him, not an abstraction. They had names, employers, faces. He was old enough to read the inquest reports when they came. He was old enough to know which photograph had been taken at which moment and what had been happening to his mother while it was being framed. The press, for William, would never again be a neutral entity. It was the apparatus that had hunted Diana, and the apparatus he would now have to live inside for the rest of his life. A small, telling moment from 2000, as his 18th birthday approached, William asked that the press receive only a single formal set of posed photographs, and that he be left otherwise alone. The palace negotiated. The press, grumbling, accepted. He got what he had asked for. It was a tiny victory, almost invisible from outside, but it set a template. He had learned very young that boundaries with the press were not granted. They were fought for, individually, item by item, year by year, and the fight never stopped. The reckoning over the Panorama interview, when it finally came, arrived more than 2 decades after the fact. In May 2021, the Dyson report concluded that the BBC journalist Martin Bashir had used forged bank statements to deceive Earl Spencer into introducing him to Diana, and that the 1995 interview, watched by some 23 million people in the United Kingdom, had been obtained by deception. The BBC apologised. The Princess of Wales had been dead for almost 24 years. William's response was unlike anything he had ever made in public. Standing in front of a camera at Kensington Palace, in a statement he had clearly written himself, he said that the interview had held no legitimacy and should never be aired again. He said it had fueled his mother's paranoia. He said it had contributed significantly to making her last years worse, to her fear, to her sense of isolation. The control in his voice was absolute, and so was the anger underneath it. The boy who had watched the interview from Andrew Gailey's quarters at Eton, weeks into his first term, furious that no one had warned him, had become a man who could finally, on the record, name what had been done to her, and through her, to him. That statement, more than any single act of his adult life, is the answer to the question of what kind of man the events of 1995 to 1997 produced. He is not someone who forgets. He is not someone who forgives easily. And he is not, despite the smooth public manner, someone without rage. The rage is simply rationed and aimed and used. In the autumn of 2001, William went up to the University of St Andrews on the east coast of Scotland. The choice was, on the surface, an unusual one for a future king. Oxford and Cambridge would have been the conventional path. St Andrews offered something Oxford and Cambridge could not: distance from London, a small town in which a determined press intrusion would be visible from a long way off, and a student body small enough to absorb him. A press agreement, again brokered by the palace, secured him 4 years of relative quiet in exchange for occasional posed access. It largely held. It was at St Andrews, in his first year, that he met a fellow student named Catherine Middleton. They lived in the same hall of residence. They became friends before they became anything else. By the time the relationship was photographed, it was already real. The deliberate slowness of it, the determination to know her in private before the world knew of her at all, was itself a continuation of the pattern of his entire life. Protect the inner life, keep the press at arm's length, find the people who knew you before they knew the title, and hold on to them. He was, by then, doing in adulthood what he had been doing since he was a small child. He was managing the gap between what could be seen and what was actually happening. He was deciding what to show and what to keep. He was rationing himself. By the time he walked out of the gates of Eton for the last time, in the summer of 2000, into a gap year that would take him to Belize, to Chile, to the dairy farms of southern England, and then on to St Andrews, he was 18 years old. He had the public composure of a man twice his age. He had the private wariness of someone who had learned, by hard experience, that there were very few people in his world without an agenda. He had buried his mother in front of 2.5 billion strangers. He had read about her private life in newspapers that other boys' fathers had brought into school. He had been, since infancy, the boy who would one day be king, and he had been since childhood the one in the room with the composure to do the comforting. What he would do with all of that, and what it would cost the people closest to him, was the question waiting on the other side of the gates. He walked out of the gates of Eton for the last time in the summer of 2000, into a gap year and then St Andrews, already carrying at 18 the public composure of a man twice his age, and the private wariness of someone who had learned that no one in his world was without an agenda. The walkout was unphotographed by agreement. He had asked for that, and the palace had negotiated it, and he had got it. It was a small victory. It was also a template. Almost everything William has built as an adult can be read as a deliberate inversion of the boyhood he was given. Look at the marriage first. He met Catherine Middleton at St Andrews in 2001, in a Scottish university chosen partly for its distance from Fleet Street, and he courted her by royal standards slowly. They lived together as students. They broke up and reconciled. He waited until he was almost 29 to marry her in April 2011. None of this resembled the rushed, dynastic 20-year-old engagement that had produced him. Then look at the children. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis are being raised, as far as it is possible inside the law of monarchy, as private children. They attend ordinary schools. They are seen on school runs in supermarket car parks. George is not addressed by any formal title in everyday life. The family lives, by preference, in a modest house on the Windsor estate, rather than in a state apartment. When the children appear in public, the appearances are rationed, posed, and followed by long stretches of silence. William has been explicit, in private briefings and occasional public remarks, that he wants his children to know who they are before the world tells them. This is not abstract parenting philosophy. It is the response of a man who at 6 was asking a teacher at Wetherby why photographers shouted at his mother. It is the response of a boy who at 12 read about his parents' intimate lives in newspapers smuggled past staff at Ludgrove. It is the response of a teenager who watched from his housemaster's quarters at Eton as 23 million people in the United Kingdom heard his mother say there were 3 people in her marriage. Every protective decision William has made for his own children has a corresponding wound in his own childhood. The map is exact. The mental health work is the same map, drawn from the other side. In 2017, through the Heads Together campaign, William spoke publicly for the first time about the long shadow of his mother's death and his own years of unprocessed grief. "I thought that if I didn't talk about it, it would go away," he told the BBC. 15 words. They contain the whole of his boyhood. The composure that adults mistook for strength. The silences at Ludgrove after the Dimbleby interview. The refusal for years to discuss Diana with anyone. The boy who had been taught by circumstance that the only safe place for feeling was somewhere no one could see it. That he eventually said the sentence out loud, on camera, in middle age, is itself a kind of late rebellion against the training. The press relationship is the third map. William's management of photographic access to his family has been, by the standards of the modern palace, almost surgical. There has been legal action against photographers who pursued Catherine on holiday. There have been public rebukes of paparazzi behaviour after near-miss car chases in London. There have been long, deliberate freezes on access for outlets judged to have crossed a line. None of this is policy in the abstract. It is the response of a man who at 15 walked behind his mother's coffin in front of 2.5 billion people because photographers in a Paris tunnel had not known when to stop. The reckoning with Martin Bashir when it finally came, made the link explicit. After the Dyson report in May 2021 concluded that Bashir had used forged documents to secure the 1995 Panorama interview, William released a statement of controlled fury, saying the interview had fueled his mother's paranoia and contributed significantly to her fear, isolation, and unhappiness in her final years. He was not speaking only as her son. He was speaking as the 13-year-old who had watched the broadcast from Andrew Gailey's quarters and not spoken to her for days afterwards, and who had now, in middle age, been given documentary proof that the wound had been inflicted by deception. The boy had grown into the man who could name what had been done. If you find these quieter, evidence-led portraits from inside the royal family worth your time, consider subscribing to Queen Toby EN. There is a great deal more in this fame to come, told in the same register and with the same attention to what the documents actually show. None of this should be mistaken for hagiography. William is not a saint of suffering, and the childhood does not absolve the adult of every later choice. He has been, by all credible accounts, a difficult brother to Harry in recent years. The rift between them, made public in painful detail by Harry's 2023 memoir, has roots in precisely the childhood traced here. Two boys carried the same weight, and they carried it differently. William, the elder, absorbed the role. Harry, the younger, eventually refused it. Each has, in his own account, felt let down by the other. The heir who never got to be a child became, in certain moments, an older brother who could not stop being the heir, and the institutional reflex he had been trained into from infancy proved harder to put down with his own family than it had been to take up. That is the cost the documents show. It is not a tidy cost. It does not resolve into a single lesson. Step back, though, and a larger pattern becomes visible. The British monarchy has always asked its children to grow up early. Queen Elizabeth II spent her adolescence in wartime, broadcasting to other children at 14, training as a mechanic at 18. Prince Charles endured a documented and miserable adolescence at Gordonston. Each generation of the family has produced an heir who was, in some measure, a child made prematurely adult by the weight of what was coming. What was different about William was the visibility. Elizabeth's wartime adolescence unfolded largely in private, mediated by newsreels she did not control, but which moved slowly and respectfully. Charles's unhappiness at school was reported but not televised, not phone-tapped, not sold by sources inside his own household. William's boyhood, by contrast, unfolded on the front pages, in real time, with his own mother as one of the principal and most candid sources. He is the first heir in British history to have been from infancy a media subject as well as a child. The Morton biography, the Dimbleby interview, the Panorama broadcast, the divorce, the funeral procession, these were not background facts of his upbringing. They were, in a real sense, his upbringing. The public record of his parents' marriage and his mother's death is also, inseparably, the record of his childhood. Return, then, to the image we began with. A small boy of around 9, sitting on the floor of his mother's bathroom at Kensington Palace, passing tissues under the locked door while Diana wept on the other side. Diana herself told this story to Andrew Morton as evidence of how sensitive and loving her elder son was. She meant it as praise. Heard now with everything that followed, it sounds like something else as well. It sounds like a diagnosis. The boy in that corridor was, in the only kingdom available to him in that moment, already king. He was the only person in the room with the composure to do the comforting. Every adult who passed through his life,
Barbara Barnes, Olga Powell, Tiggy Legg Burke, Ken Wharf, Paul Burrell, Patrick Jeffson, Andrew Gailey, his father, his grandmother, his mother herself, has at some point described, in some form of words, being struck by how grown up he was. They meant it as a compliment. It was also a description of what had been taken. When William one day becomes king, he will be the first British monarch whose entire life has been documented from the cradle, and the first who knew, from a very young age, exactly what the institution had cost the person he loved most.
He has had longer than any of his predecessors to think about what he wants the role to be, and shorter than any of them to remember a time before the cameras. What kind of king that produces is the question his reign will answer, and it will not be answered quickly. Picture him now, Prince of Wales, standing at the edge of a public event, watching his own son George move through a crowd. The face is composed. It has been composed since he was 9. Behind the composure, though, a calculation is visible to anyone who knows where to look. How much of this can the boy be spared? How much, in the end, cannot? That is the question he inherited in a Kensington Palace bathroom, and it is the question he has not yet, in any reign or in any lifetime, finished asking.